As the Eurozone continues to be threatened by the unfolding sovereign debt crisis, European leaders prepare for a key EU summit this week in Brussels. But with little hope for a solution to this crisis, many are now wondering how it began in the first place. This is the GRTV Feature Interview with your host James Corbett and our guest, F. William Engdahl. Perhaps we can get your take on the background to this collapse and the geopolitics behind it.
Well, I think the best way to look at what's going on in the Eurozone is to look at what was going on at the end of 2009 with the dollar and with Wall Street banks. And I'm talking about the big six, roughly. Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and so. And at that point, the Chinese were openly saying that they're about ready to consider alternatives to their dollar investments, their treasury investments, which were by then well over close to $2 trillion, as I recall. And that's serious money. Because the Chinese felt that the U.S. fiscal policy was profligate, which it certainly was. And at that point, suddenly, mirabilis dictu, or deus ex machina, whatever you want to call it, a crisis erupted under the newly elected Papandreou government in Greece, where they announced that the actual size of the Greek public debt was vastly larger than the previous conservatives had announced to the public. And that what came out is that in 2002, the conservative government in Greece was able to sneak into the Eurozone and meet the strict criteria on the surface, strict criteria of debt to GDP and other criteria, by hiding the real debts that they were incurring through exotic derivatives that were crafted for them by none other than Goldman Sachs. Interesting. Okay, we'll keep that name in mind because in a few minutes it's going to make more sense. Well, 2002, Goldman Sachs is on the inside of the game. Papademos, the so-called technocrat who's now running the Greek government under this national emergency coalition, Papademos was head of the Greek National Bank in 2002, facilitating as a counterparty this semi-legal, it was legal technically, but in fact it was illegal in the spirit of the Maastricht Treaty, this hiding of the Greek debt. So Papademos was in on the fix from the beginning. He didn't say, Goldman Sachs, I think this is a dishonest deal that you're doing in spirit, and we shouldn't do this. We should be honest that we're not ready to enter the Eurozone. No, he didn't do that. His assistant at the Central Bank of Greece at the time had come from Goldman Sachs. Another interesting fact. We just leave these as facts. Okay, then Greece comes in, the weak link of the euro. Greece comes into the Eurozone. And in December 2009, lo and behold, it comes out that Greece is not qualified to be in the Eurozone because of this huge debt that it's carrying. So suddenly, the attention of financial speculators, hedge funds and others, but it's, of course, the Wall Street banks, goes on to one theme, the weakness of the euro construct. Now, this has been a sleeping dog since the euro came into being in 1999, 2000, 2001, that there is no central fiscal policy, but there is a central bank. And so long as there wasn't a massive speculative attack on the euro and on the bonds of the Eurozone countries, that wasn't a problem. And it was papered over. Everybody knew about it in Brussels. Everybody knew about it in Germany and Greece and all these other countries. But they hoped that the test would somehow not come. Well, the test did come, and it's come big time. Then in early 2010, we had a situation where there was a meeting in New York, and this was reported, I believe, in the New York Times, as I recall. There was a meeting of several of the largest hedge fund operators or managers in the world. Among them, our friend George Soros of Quantum Fund, or Soros Management Group, it's called. And they discussed the quote-unquote Greek problem. And you can bet that those hedge funds discussing in common, they weren't just having a casual cup of coffee talking about the latest World Series game. They were talking about where to put their money on which side of the speculative ledger. And so of course, when the big boys go in on a speculative bet, then all sorts of small hedge funds and investment funds and others around the world began to take notice, in banks, and they pile in behind. And that's pretty much what happened. So there was a speculative wave of attack against Greek sovereign debt. And that put the focus on the euro, took the pressure off the dollar, interestingly enough. And, so as that crisis developed into March of 2010, the day that there was a consensus reached in principle among the leaders, the political leaders of the Eurozone countries, Angela Merkel for Germany and Sarkozy in France and so, on that same day, Standard & Poor's did something unprecedented in its history. They never did this when the long-term capital management crisis was erupting. They never did it during the dot-com bubble or the Exxon crisis, when the warning signals were there flashing red well beforehand. They not only downgraded the sovereign debt of Greece, they downgraded it 3 notches. Now, 3 notches happened to put the debt of Greece into so-called junk bond category. And that meant that pension funds all around the world who were holding supposedly secure sovereign debt, it's something that doesn't default very often. You can look it up in the record books. Suddenly, they were forced by the regulations of what pension funds can and cannot hold, they were forced to dump all the Greek debt on the same day onto the market. Well, that exploded, and of course, we can imagine that Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase were piggybacking on this with all sorts of credit default swaps and just leveraging the speculative pressure against the Greece sovereign debt and also the Eurozone.
Well, a very, very important analysis, and I think something that is missing from too much of the analysis out there. So allow me to perhaps draw out and spell out some of the things that you tactfully left unsaid there. But I take it that your implication is that the entire Eurozone collapse has been at least partially triggered by Anglo-American banking interests who have a vested interest in maintaining the dollar hegemony well past the death of the petrodollar paradigm, and that this is some sort of speculative attack.
I don't see any other way to understand it. And it's not merely a speculative attack, but once you set the snowball rolling down the mountain, the avalanche begins to ensue. And that's what we're seeing happening after the initial snowball was thrown. And it was deliberately thrown by Wall Street, by Treasury Secretary Geithner, by Bernanke at the Fed. The comments they made during this whole sensitive time were not constructive. They were, no other interpretation is possible. They were designed to feed into the crisis atmosphere around the euro. There's one very big difference, James, that I have to add here. The difference between the underlying real economy of the Eurozone countries and that of the United States, which has now 103% debt to GDP. It's U.S. is getting in the range of the Greek debt to GDP ratios, or the Italian. The U.S. doesn't have a real economy base to rebuild on. The multinational corporations, the Wall Street banks, and so forth, over the last 30 years have made a conscious political decision, geopolitical decision, to outsource American industry to Asia, Eastern Europe, Poland, in some cases to Russia, to China above all, and to simply take that as a pure financial play, and irrespective of what that's done to hollow out the industrial base of the American economy. If you go into an American, a quality American graduate school for engineering or science today, MIT, Caltech, you name it, I venture to say that a large number, if not a majority, of the graduate students going for PhDs in science and engineering in those universities in America today are going to have Chinese surnames, Asian surnames above all. It may be Indian, it doesn't matter, but they are not recruiting doctors and engineers in the graduate level in American universities from inside the United States. It's largely coming from outside. So the climate of entrepreneurship is fine, but what are you going to entrepreneur? What are you going to build with your brilliant brain? You can't eat IT, web network solutions. You can't eat. I recall having a discussion when I was on a recent visit in China with a professor from a very prestigious American university who had East Coast University, who had a project in China. And we were talking about the doldrums of the American economy. He was rather gentle in his critique. And I said, well, as I'm saying now, I see the biggest problem is the hollowing out of the industrial base and the real economy in the United States. It's gone into a service economy. He said, yes, that's a very serious problem, although there are bright spots. For example, there's a whole new industry growing up developing apps for iPhones. And I had to hold myself back from laughing at this distinguished professor, because let's look at what it takes to feed and clothe a nation of 360 million people at an adequate standard of living for the 21st century. You have to have more than apps to eat and put on the breakfast table. I'm sorry.
Or to engineer the iPhones on which the apps are made, which of course has also been outsourced to China. It is absolutely
it's done in China.
Yeah,
I know.
Exactly. Well, it is. I mean, it's a self-parodying system in many ways, and it leads to me one of the interesting dichotomies here, because you mentioned, of course, the very deliberate strategy and very deliberate outsourcing of America's industrial engine to primarily China in the past few decades, but that, of course, necessarily builds up China as a sort of counterbalance against American hegemonic interests. So, what is the real strategy at play there?